In a far reach of the world, under a grim, lonely hill, lies a crypt, filled with terrible traps and ferocious guardians. Treasures fill the tomb, guarded by the layer's keeper, the malevolent and cunning architect of death and decay, Acererak. Having escaped death through lichdom, he houses his intelligence in a bejeweled skull and his soul in a hidden phylactery. His legacy spans from the ancient days of his mortal life to his ascension as a powerful lich, and eventually his place in the most infamous dungeon in all of Dungeons & Dragons, the Tomb of Horrors. Acererak was born of the union between a Baylor named Tarnhem and a human named Kessa III. Kessa III raised Acererak at the fringes of society, afraid of what might occur if the people of her town learned of her son's half-demon heritage. But they did find out, and in his 10th year, Acererak could only watch as a mob lynched his mother and burned their home to the ground. Only Acererak's inhuman nature allowed him to survive long enough to flee. The events of his life between his childhood escape and his re-emergence as a potent wielder of arcane powers are vague. Some claim that he began searching at a young age for a means of becoming undead, to escape the life he found so wretched. Other tales maintain that Acererak apprenticed with none other than Vecna himself, while the latter was still a lich and had not ascended to divinity. This is further corroborated with some sources that we see from Vecna's story. In fact, Acererak is the whole reason Vecna has such an obsession with keeping secrets. The tale starts when Vecna was leading his forces across the world of Greyhawk in his first major assault on a city. Rumors say this was Vecna's hometown that he was first attacking. At this time, Acererak, the demonic half-breed mage, was one of his generals. Vecna found himself in quite a dangerous situation facing off against some clerics of Pelor. Acererak swooped in and was able to save Vecna from destruction. And Vecna, in perhaps his first act of gratitude in his entire life, allowed Acererak access to his rotted tower in the upper levels of his keep. But if you know anything about Acererak's story, he would not be content to serve under Vecna forever. It turns out Acererak had arranged Vecna's near destruction and rescue that day so that he could ingratiate himself with his master and put himself in a position to steal Vecna's darkest, most powerful secrets in the rotted tower. And for a time, Acererak's deception succeeded. Several years passed before Vecna uncovered this deception, but with the help of Vivistani, Acererak had already seen his doom coming and fled. Eventually, after this time, Acererak spends more time amassing power with these new secrets, and clearly something that he found in one of Vecna's tomes led him to Orcus, the demon lord of undeath and sponsor of liches. Acererak resurfaced as a worshipper of Orcus, using the cult's resources to construct a number of layers and tombs, the most infamous of which would become known as the Tomb of Horrors. There are those that say Acererak was using Orcus and his worshippers and had no true loyalty to the demon prince. During this time, Acererak also relocated to Baal Turath, an empire filled with tieflings. Acererak found some acceptance here, as I suppose each of them had some unwanted connection with fiends, the tieflings being devils and Acererak being demons. Acererak continued in this path for a while, until he finally became a lich, with the help of Orcus. And as soon as he attained this lichdom, Acererak ceased paying homage to Orcus, lending credence to the notion that his worship had never been more than a means to an end. He confined himself to his Tomb of Horrors, spending years in study and honing his powers to prepare for his ultimate triumph. It is said that eventually his undead body wasted away, leaving him as a Demilich, an animated skull, and still he prepared on. Slowly, these rumors of Acererak's tomb spread, rumors of great treasure that was supposedly buried. But of course, these rumors were orchestrated by Acererak. He planned to use the souls of the world's greatest heroes who entered this tomb to empower a ritual that would allow him to take possession of all undead throughout the planes, granting him true immortality and sufficient power to ensure that all the living world suffered as he himself had suffered. This Tomb of Horrors comes from the earliest origins of Dungeons & Dragons. It is the ultimate challenge of a group's skill. And in that first edition, it is canon that eventually some adventurers made it to the end as Acererak underestimated their skill. Demilich's ritual was disrupted, the device he used to store the soul energy was destroyed, and Acererak was all but obliterated, his essence left to float in the void between planes, powerless and helpless for all time. But as we'll see, The story of how the tomb was created and Acererak's apparent demise has many different iterations. 3rd edition claims that Acererak left behind a diary in the Tomb of Horrors that give us the true story, that only a few have seen the full tale. In his diary, Acererak wrote that he was born of a union between a woman and a demon, as we expect, and he had hideous deformities. He was run out of town and his mother was killed, burned to death by some superstitious villagers that visited them. Acererak survived through this fire due to his demonic heritage. In his diary, this is the moment that put him on the path toward necromancy and revenge against all of humanity. Much of the story from here is the exact same. He feared death, so he became a lich through the means of Orcus. His power grew and grew, but this diary relates, however, that Acererak eventually felt the forces animated his undead body began to wane. Knowing that final oblivion was near even through lichdom, he decided to build himself a secret tomb. He wrote, "Only those of keenest luck and greatest skill will win through to me. There they shall receive a magnificent reward for their persistence." The diary, the Tomb of Horrors, and the supposed reward were all parts of an elaborate ruse designed to bring powerful adventurers into the portion of the tomb that Acererak calls his Fortress of Conclusion. In truth, Acererak had devised a ritual that he hoped would merge his consciousness with the negative energy plane through the sacrifice of potent spirits. If accomplished, he could assume control of any undead on any plane and gain godlike powers as well as immortality. But the infamy of the Tomb of Horrors drew more than wealth-hungry thrill seekers, intent on gaining the reward promised in Acererak's diary. Supplicants also came. Necromancers following in Acererak's footsteps, questing for knowledge, seekers of eternal life and lost souls in search of purpose, all traveled alike to the tomb to learn what they could of the dark arts. In time, the supplicants became worshippers, and they stayed to dwell near the object of their devotion. Eventually, a settlement called Skull City sprang up around the entrance to Acererak's tomb. Some of the heroes Acererak lured to his tomb proved even more powerful and ingenious than he had anticipated. This initial plan of Acererak was thwarted. At the last possible moment, they surmised Acererak's plan and destroyed the artifact that was crucial to his hypothesis. They struck down Acererak and shattered his phylactery. Normally, such an action would have sent Acererak's spirit to the abyss, but the worship of the Skull City residents lent him a semblance of divinity. His desire to merge with the negative energy plane proved stronger than the pull of the abyss. Unfortunately for Acererak, souls do not travel to the negative energy plane upon death. Since his spirit had no clear destination, it went nowhere, becoming a vestige divorced from any plane. In a way, this gave him the immortality he sought, but none of the power that should accompany it. He still has a strong influence, he still has followers, and he still has a semblance of godhood. But of course, Acererak's story does not stop here. It took him decades, but Acererak eventually resumed his physical form through sheer force of will, and he plotted a new scheme during that period that could potentially gain him even more power than he had before. The wise understand that substantial power can be found among the souls of the dead. For ages, the Raven Queen Orcus and Vecna have competed for the power over the dead, hoping to learn what lies beyond the veil through which even the gods cannot peer, or at least to control that energy. Acererak follows in these three's footsteps. As before, he seeks to use powerful rituals to obtain power over the entire world. But the Demilich knows better than to throw his own hat into the ring with these divine entities. He lets the gods and devils and demons squabble over the souls of mortals, while he seeks his power among the souls of divine beings. Acererak knows that history has shown that even the gods can die. Even immortal gods are nothing of the kind, and it is from this fact that Acererak seeks to draw power. None can say whether the spirits of gods pass on to an afterlife as mortals do, but the power they once held must still be present, and the Demilich is determined to make that power his own. He spent years preparing himself, performing rituals, ensuring that the stars aligned, and constructing his great eldritch engines that are more than just machines, alchemical and arcane machines, as well as structures and complexes constructed in specific patterns whose inner surfaces are covered in thousands of arcane runes, all with a single purpose: to channel eldritch energy. These contain traps, puzzles, monsters, all to keep fools and adventurers, or foolish adventurers, from learning the truth of the engine's purpose. These machines are his dungeons, the Tomb of Horrors, and they will channel enough planar energy to Acererak to allow him to absorb the lingering power of history's dead gods. And even the living gods can scarcely imagine what the Demilich can do with such power. This is the setup for 4th edition's Tomb of Horrors. As you'll see, the Tomb of Horrors has many rewrites. All over the early editions up until 4th, Acererak comes back with another Tomb of Horrors, where they redesign it. And of course, being a D&D adventure, one group of adventurers must find their way to the end of this 4th edition Tomb of Horrors to thwart Acererak, and they do, but not completely. They might stop Acererak's scheme to become a god in the Tomb of Horrors, but they do not slay Acererak before he completes his last-ditch rituals and rebuilds his phylactery. In fact, at the end of this, even though it's considered a success, the Demilich has become an entity roughly on par with the Demon Lord. He's again effectively immortal, although again, his plan has been foiled. Acererak now has greater magic and his tomb, and he has not given up any thoughts of revenge. 4th edition even has this to say: Acererak's skull, which dwells in the mithril vault of the Tomb of Horrors, is a construct created by the Demilich. Acererak designed the skull to facilitate an elaborate plot that involves the collection of souls, some of the processes we already know about. If the construct is destroyed, the Demilich arranges for a new skull. The real Acererak resides in his Fortress of Conclusion, a stronghold hidden in the Shadowfell, because 4th edition cannot resist bringing in the Raven Queen or Shadowfell into every plot. For centuries, Acererak has plotted a terrible apotheosis to merge his consciousness with undead everywhere. He need only acquire sufficient power and ample souls. And we already saw his 4th edition plot foiled. Skull City is still around as well. The inhabitants are obsessed with Acererak and the power of the dark arts. They revere him, and they name him the Devourer. They constructed a massive academy over Acererak's tomb. It is a school of magic, religion, and necromancy named the Bleak Academy. It harbors cultists who perform ceremonies to garner the attention and favor of Acererak. The inhabitants have left the tomb sacrosanct, though they allow groups of treasure-seeking adventurers to enter, regarding such allowances as offerings to the Devourer. But these leaders of the Bleak Academy do not have the full picture even. They only know a glimmer of Acererak's true motives. And they do not even know the secret that Acererak's skull within the Tomb of Horrors is not his real skull. And finally, we get to 5th edition, which has some slight alterations or corrections to Acererak's story. He anticipated his own transformation and prepared for it by setting enchanted gemstones into his skull's eye sockets and teeth. Each of these gems possessed the power to capture souls on which his phylactery would feed. He abandoned his physical body and traveled the planes as a disembodied consciousness. If the skull that was his last physical remains was ever disturbed, its gems would claim the souls of the insolent intruders to his tomb and magically transfer them to his phylactery. Acererak does still have his skull on the material plane in this, and it is not his real body. He is not on the Shadowfell or anywhere else. Instead, he is just disembodied, floating through the cosmos in the planes. And of course, what kind of edition of Dungeons & Dragons would 5th edition be if it didn't have its own tomb? The Tomb of Annihilation. Something evil is trapping the souls of the dead and draining life from all who have been raised from death by magic. This worldwide death curse not only prevents the raising of the dead, but also causes creatures that were previously raised from the dead to wither and die. Of course, the answers to this problem lie at the bottom of a tomb, the tomb of the 9 gods. 9 trickster gods, each embodying a different alignment. Venturing deeper into the tomb, the players inevitably discover that the architect of this tomb is none other than the archlich Acererak. But Acererak is not powering himself up in 5th edition. He is taking and feeding souls to an undead horror called an Atropol. An Atropol is of course none other than a ghastly, unfinished creation of an evil god. A malnuformed, unfinished, hateful, miserable horror. And although they're undead abominations, they are stillborn godlings, which surely have some divine spark within them. During this story, we do get some interesting things that it says about Acererak. Now, it's not clear if they're clarifications or alterations to Acererak's story, but it definitely affects some things that we know about him. He does come from Oath in the Greyhawk setting, but since he became a powerful lich, he just travels the plains in search of artifacts. He finds things interesting and puts them away. It says he's powerful enough to pursue godhood, but he has no interest in becoming a god or being worshipped like Vecna. He prefers to create evil gods and unleash them on mortals and immortals who oppose him. And he's passed up multiple opportunities for godhood. Of course, this conflicts with some of the goals of his previous tombs, but we can let Acererak tell himself anything that makes himself feel better about losing to adventurers in his previous tombs of horror. Acererak, in his drifting through the plains, found an atropole at the edge of the negative plane. He built a machine called the Soulmonger to nourish it to godhood through the use of souls. The Lich chose one of his tombs, the Tomb of the Nine Gods on Toril, to serve as the atropole's nursery. Another tomb, another plot to unleash death, undead, and chaos onto the rest of the plains. The Nine Gods, of course, have a lot to do with this tomb, as it has their namesake, and Acererak has some history with them. There is an ancient city, Omu, in Chult. It was the jewel of Chult's crown. A city garnered wealth in abundance. To enter Omu was to enter the gates of paradise itself, but such wealth brought greed. Omu's hunger for slaves made her rulers demand ever greater tribute from their neighbors. When their vassals couldn't pay in flesh, they paid in blood. Eventually, their greed and hubris angered the god Ubtao, causing him to turn his back on Omu. The clerics lost their spells, and the city fell to sickness and disease. The slave uprisings wrecked Omu, and its nobles fled in droves. With Ubtao gone, primal spirits arose from the rainforest to bewitch the few remaining Omuans. They disguised themselves as jungle creatures and promised great power in return for devotion. Desperate for redemption, the Omuans tore down their temple to Ubtao and raised shrines to the 9 trickster gods. The new deities were divisive and cruel. Too weak to grant miracles to every follower, they concocted elaborate trials to winnow the clergy. On holy days, the mettle of aspirant priests was tested in their 9 shrines with deadly consequences for failure. The trials provided entertainment for the degenerate Omuans and fed their weakling gods with much needed sacrifices. And for 9 decades, the city folk lived by the mantras of their trickster gods. They built statues in their names and schemed each other to assert their chosen god's dominance. Omu's glorious past was gone, but in a way, its people endured. Of course, this entire story was very tempting to Acererak. And if you mention a tomb and killing people, Acererak will show up on your doorstep. He entered Omu and slew all 9 trickster gods. He then enslaved the Omuans and forced them to carve out a tomb for their defeated gods. When the tomb was complete, Acererak murdered the Omuans and sealed them in the tomb with their false gods. The archlich resumed his odyssey across the plains, content that the dungeon would feed his phylactery with the souls of dead adventurers. In Acererak's absence, the tomb did its job in ensnaring adventurers from faraway lands and harvested their souls to feed the archlich's phylactery. After he found the atropole, he put the whole system into place, waiting for an untold number of souls to enter into the atropole, watching from afar as his death god arose. In this module, the adventurers can fight Acererak. He should be way above any of their power. They should prove very easy for him. But something happened when he slew those trickster gods, and anytime he appears, any character inhabited by the spirit of a trickster god hears that spirit cry out for vengeance, and they gain some massive buffs against Acererak in combat. So it is possible to wound him greatly. But of course he's a lich. If he gets low on health, he has many ways to leave, and if he actually does end up dying, he would reform near his phylactery, which is in some far-flung demiplane that perhaps no one but Acererak himself knows. And so the adventure, of course, ends with the adventurers having a possibility of foiling Acererak's plan again. Another tomb, another plot ruined. They destroy the Soulmonger device and free within the souls that were trapped. But again, they do not destroy the tomb itself, and Acererak is still free to float the plains. And that's where we leave his story in 5th edition. The tombs and the Tomb of Horrors across D&Ds have been some of the greatest adventures in all of Dungeons & Dragons. In a way, these are just recreations of the same classic adventure that people loved all the way back in earlier editions of D&D. But the Demilich behind them still has a story throughout, and even though times it gets cobbled up about exactly what Acererak is doing or what happened to him, it's pretty clear that Acererak has an untold number of tombs across the multiverse. He's seen in Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms in official adventures. Other than that, we're told that he has an immortal presence and the ability to fly around to any plane in order to start these plans in order to gain himself more power or cause more chaos. He keeps his phylactery hidden, and neither the gods nor spells can divine its location. Time is his most powerful ally. Even if he's defeated by some adventurers in some tomb, they will eventually die. His plan or ritual of the day might be stopped, all the while he's collecting an untold amount of souls across an untold amount of tombs. It's clear he takes some sick pleasure in devouring the souls of adventurers. He wants to make the people suffer who made him suffer. He is a deeply flawed being, and unlike many other villains in Dungeons & Dragons, even though a lot of his early plans have to do with taking over the world, eventually he just wants to sow chaos and discourse. He wants to make gods. He wants to take control of all undead. He wants to disrupt life in any way he can. Although he has lived on many worlds and crafted countless demi-planes, Acererak spends most of his time building tombs, filling them with treasure to attract powerful adventurers, killing them off in terrible fashions with deadly traps and monsters, while baiting and ridiculing them. The terror he evokes scars their souls. He has been defeated many times, but Acererak will always come back. Another plot, another tomb, another dead adventurer, and Acererak will be laughing as he claims one more soul. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video on Acererak, the second most infamous Lich in all of D&D. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and please leave a comment down below if you want to see any other characters or anything in D&D lore covered in a video. Thanks so much for watching, everyone.